Welcome to the inaugural session of the Lunch and Learn Law Enforcement Leadership Conversations. I'm Dr. Robbie Friedman, the founding director of the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, GILEE, at Georgia State University's Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. We're excited to bring all of you together today. The idea for this Lunch and Learn series came out of the extended period of distancing that COVID-19 has caused. Many of you have adapted to the new normal, while the pandemic has disrupted day-to-day in-person learning and sharing of ideas. We at GILEE, like many of you, have seen how virtual meetings can continue to link us in ways we didn't think possible prior to COVID-19. Each of these meetings will feature law enforcement leaders who will engage in a moderated conversation about key issues that touch upon the insights, concerns, innovations, dilemmas, experiences, solutions, and their visions of policing. These monthly conversations are designed for law enforcement leaders, corporate security chiefs, and civic leaders. They intend to provide an opportunity to discuss policing and public safety issues, challenges and solutions to foster better public-private partnerships. We intend to host these sessions on the last Wednesday of each month at the same time. So we encourage you all to grab your lunch and learn together. We want to say a special thanks to the Georgia Post and the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police for providing training credits. If you are interested in these credits, please look for an email from GILEE with directions to apply following this webinar. Before we introduce our speakers, I'm pleased to mention that we have 217 people registered for this session, and I'd like to recognize just a few of them. IACP past president Paul Sell, who went to Hungary with GILEE and IACP in 2018. IACP past president Stephen Stevens, who went to Israel with GILEE in 2018. Chief Kristen Zeman, IACP Vice President at Large, and Chief John Lettany, fourth IACP Vice President, who is now Chief in Thomasville Police, Georgia. We also hail participants from several countries: Bahamas, Canada, Germany, Hungary, Israel, and the UK. And from the United States, we have representatives from Alabama, California, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Missouri, North Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Tennessee, Virginia, and Wisconsin. With this, I'm honored to present three prominent chiefs who did not only make a difference in their communities, but also made the impact felt nationally and internationally. I'll go alphabetically. Start with Chief Stacy Cotton from Covington, Georgia. Was a former president of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police, 2009 to 2010. He is now a candidate for fifth vice president of the IACP. And he also went to Israel, was the 9th delegation to Israel in 2001, and was a member of the first delegation to the UK in 2007 for Olympic preparations for the 2012 Games. Chief C.J. Davis, Durham, North Carolina. She's a past president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE, 2019 to 20. And she participated in the trailblazing delegation to Israel in 2013, out of which the Atlanta Police Leadership Institute has developed its Tier 5 leadership development program. And last but not least, Chief Lou Beckmore, LaGrange, Georgia, former president of the Georgia Association of Chiefs of Police, 2004 and 5, president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, 2017 and 18, and a member of the 12th delegation to Israel in 2004, and the IACP delegation to Israel in 2018, and the IACP delegation to Hungary in 2018. What I'd like to do now is put up a number of questions that will help serve as a discussion point for our participant. Let me see if, can you see the questions?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So basically we're dealing with a new normal, and you heard the new normal every time we have a new normal. But we had a year of COVID-19 that is not over yet. We had a tremendous amount of loss of life, social unrest, political tensions, economic slowdown, limited travel, restrictions on movement, localized natural disasters, the latest one in Texas, and budget cuts. So here are just a few questions for you to sort of pick from, and then we can start a conversation. Have you changed any of your current practices? If so, what are you doing differently now that maybe a year ago you did not do? Community policing places an emphasis on all government agencies working together to combat crime. Why do you think police still have strongest burden when crime statistics are presented? How can community policing be improved? How can trust be built between police and community? Can you describe some steps you have taken to improve community relations? What steps are you taking to improve the professional development of your officers? What do you see as an immediate challenge that must be addressed to improve policing? And what long-term challenges do you see? What are your thoughts about police reform? And finally, how do you recommend to cope with the growing antagonism against police? So with that, I'm going to take the questions off, and I'll throw the handling of these questions to anyone who wants to have a first go at it.
So, because I'm the only girl on the panel, I'll show them what leadership looks like.
Very good, very good.
These are my friends, and it's an honor for me to be here with both of them, and also with you, Robbie. Good to see you again. And to all our colleagues that are out there listening, all our colleagues and friends, thank you for taking time today. One of the questions that just sort of sticks out to me is, have we changed our current practices? And I think we've all been challenged over the last, year and a half or so to really stretch ourselves because of the many challenges we faced, over the last several months. Everything from, watching the country be subjected to an international pandemic. Law enforcement doesn't have a playbook on that. We've all been through trainings and tabletop exercises and have, sat through all of that so that when the day came, we'd be ready for it. But I'm sure I can speak not just for myself, but for my colleagues as well, that this has been a very challenging time for us, not just to keep our fingers on the pulse of the community during these complexities, but also the workforce. How has COVID-19 impacted our officers? How has it impacted their families, morale? How has it impacted crime? That's a continuous conversation that these last 12 months have been an anomaly in fighting crime. And how do you fight crime effectively, in a pandemic? So some of the really important things for me as a leader of an organization is to maintain communication, because I think that was the first thing I noticed, that we're all aren't in the same room anymore. We took for granted that we were going to see each other in the hallways and have water cooler conversations about whatever issues that was going on, ComStat meetings, and everything went to a virtual sort of environment. So we've had to be creative, but in a sense, it's made us better in our communication. We're utilizing technology now more and touching more of our staff and even our community members because we found ourselves in this space. So I think it's caused us to be more creative in how we do our work every day, and probably incorporating some of these new practices even in the future after we get out of this pandemic type of threat environment.
I'll go next on that same topic, just to kind
Go
of
ahead.
emphasize that. And first I want to say that, you know, prior to us going live with everybody, CJ had given Lou and I direct orders to make sure that, you know, we gave her plenty of time to talk. So don't everybody, of course, the gentlemen let the ladies go first. So
Right.
good comment, CJ. I think one of the things that was apparent to me when some of the civil unrest began was we were being inundated both locally and by people from the outside of my jurisdiction, for example, wanting to know where we stood on some of these issues of law enforcement practices. And the one that jumps to mind most is you know, checking how are we meeting these things. We got these emails that my elected officials did about 8 can't wait, the things that needed to be acted upon right now. And I read over those, and I already kind of knew the answer, but we did a top-down review of our GILEE standards and our policies. Been doing that, and being a 35-year agency in the GILEE process, we realized that we met 98% of what people were asking for, and the only things that we technically didn't meet were probably wording issues. Not the intent of our policy was meeting it. We were already in compliance or in one form or fashion already addressing it, but it would have been more along the lines of within our culture we knew we were addressing. And the best example of that, for example, is I've never been taught, and I've been in this business for over 34 years, chokeholds. We had quit the practice, suspended the practice of it before I even came into law enforcement. My department's never done it, never taught it, never sanctioned it. But it wasn't in our policy because we just didn't do it. But if I post my policy publicly on the internet, for example, and a citizen were to read that my use of force policy and didn't see any mention of chokeholds, they're probably assuming that we're allowing chokeholds. And so that's what we did, was we clarified our policy. We tweaked our policy to make sure that we tend, I think, in law enforcement, that we know what we're talking about. We know what we're doing, but we don't necessarily communicate it to the public in a clear way that a layperson or a person that's not within the law enforcement world and realm would understand it. And so we did a top-down review of what are we putting out to the public so that they can understand clearly what it is that we do without our explanation if they read it or see it. And I think it was really a good process for us, and it kind of re-emphasized our officers where we stood on those types of issues.
In a sense, do you look at policies as a contract with the community and your officers?
Yes, absolutely. It's, you know, people ask me all the time, you know, what does accreditation get us? Because quite frankly, there's a lot of accrediting bodies out there now in many facets of the world. And I tell them, I said, I always remind them, well, you want to send your child to an accredited college, you want to go to an accredited hospital, why wouldn't you want an accredited police department? But really what it does, in my department, as long as we've been doing it now, it's the culture of our agency to understand that we meet national standards, we meet best practices. And that was reinforced when all of a sudden the world was questioning law enforcement practices in this country, that we didn't have any shortcomings, but we got to do a better job of getting that information out and letting people know that what we do, because I think, again, we get lost in our own terminology and don't realize that the average citizen doesn't understand our terminology. We've got to be a little more plain spoken, plain English.
Well,
Thank you. Lou?
yeah, I was going to echo and focus on, you know, the importance of accreditation as a management tool. I don't think it's an accident that the three of us just happen to be with accredited agencies. And accreditation is not a substitute for leadership, but in the hands of vibrant leadership, it's a continuous process of improvement by objective standards and the opportunity for peer review. And I would disagree, I guess, maybe a little with Stacy, where, you know, he suggests that, you know, we're doing this. Well, some of us are doing this, but the problem is not enough of us are doing this. There's over 18,000 police agencies, less than 1,000 are accredited. I just got a call this morning. I assume everybody in Georgia has seen the incident with the Hamilton police chief and the officer and the dialogue. A citizens group called me and said, we were at city council meeting, we learned that there's no policies or procedures for that department. And so when you have departments in the 21st century that don't even have policies and procedures on 12 critical tasks that are responsible for 90% of the litigation, I think it suggests that, we've got to do some intentional review internally of our profession and what kind of accountability is there for these agency heads that don't engage in a way that when things are mishandled, we're the ones as a profession that suffer the consequences. The bills that were dropped, I think there are about 30 bills that have been dropped in the Georgia legislature. I had the accreditation manager go through the bills. Each and every one are addressed through GILEE standards that have been around for 20, 25, 30, in Stacy's case, what, Stacy, 35 years?
35, yeah.
Yeah. And the problem, though, is if this stuff is passed as legislation and as laws, you now have a violation of law that can be or potentially is going to be addressed in the courts, as opposed to us handling it as an administrative action. And so it's an invitation for the legislature. It's an invitation for political oversight in the way of civilian review boards. It's an invitation for plaintiffs' lawyers to challenge us when we don't do those things that we should do to ensure accountability. And, you spoke about, is policies, should they be shared, or should there be some sort of community engagement? Well, the fact is, policies should reflect a social contract. And the way it works, and where agencies, I think, sometimes fail, is through our elected leaders, we get the tools we need to keep the public safe. But the part of the contract that sometimes we forget is anytime we use that tool, we got to be prepared to explain it, regardless on who we apply it to, regardless who asks. And it's that lack of transparency. It's when folks have to fight to get information about, a particular event or a use of force or a bad outcome that just undermines the confidence that people have in us. And so I could go through a host of examples of, where we fall short. And when I say we, not we individually, because I would imagine probably all the chiefs that are on here are engaged in a way that reflects vibrant leadership that doesn't have the kind of defects or deficiencies that have given rise to the scrutiny that we've seen in the last year. And so that's the problem. The folks that aren't here are the ones that need to hear this.
Lou, you said something earlier about having to have agencies that are accredited, and you didn't only refer to police. Everybody wants a standardized, accredited hospital or university. And the issue of a contract is important. And I have to share one example to show you how it applies to not just to police. The contract in the university between professors and students is the syllabus. Because in the syllabus, you tell what is going to be taught, how it's going to be taught, what are the reading assignments, how are the exams, when they're given, what are the grades, and so on and so forth. And there was a student, and I always remember this, who came to me and he failed the class and he wanted to have a special paper to make up for the grade. I said, I can't do that because it's not in the syllabus. He says, what do you mean it's not in the syllabus? I said, have you read the syllabus? No. He said, well, that's problem number one. So why can't you do that? I said, because if I give it to you, I have to give it to everybody else. And if it's not in the syllabus, I can't do that. He says, just don't tell them. And the shaping of policies that are made public and tenable, that helps police departments and municipalities from lawsuits that accreditation agencies can indeed protect. So thank you for making that point.
Well, but the other thing, and we've mentioned policy, oftentimes we say policy, we think of the written directive. That's an element of policy. Policy is the written directive, training on the policy, active supervision to ensure adherence to the policy, corrective action or remediation when there's a violation of policy, looking at your trends. So do they suggest you need to modify your training or modify your written directive? And then finally, are you reviewing it for freshness? So are you incorporating that new technology? Are you incorporating those best practices? Are you incorporating the changes in case law or the evolving standard of our profession? So oftentimes when folks say policy, they just think of that written directive, and that's just an element.
Good point.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Lou's saying there, and all the times of my years of being a police chief and litigation that's come from, you know, questions about a police officer's action. It is more about it's not just about the written policy, it's about the standard that you're meeting. Is it a national practice, but also did you train it? Did you enforce it? Is it a custom? Is it a practice? Is it a behavior, a culture of your department? And I think that's very critical is that it's an ongoing organic thing that continues to be modified. We just had a recent issue with our pursuit policy with a commander, and you know, it required us to understand that we need to tweak our policy a little bit more, even though we've had basically the same pursuit policy for many years. It grows, it breathes, it lives, and I don't want folks to think just because we're a CLE agency that's the end all be all to everything. I think it just gives the model and the structure that you have to continually self-assess, and I think that's what it gives you, and not just self-assess internally. But self-assess against what are practices, what are the issues. I think one of the things that we're seeing right now in our country is that what people, whether it be our citizens, our politicians, whatever entity it may be, what their expectation of law enforcement is, what are we gauging ourselves against, not just internally or amongst ourselves, but what are we gauging ourselves against what our citizens want, what our communities want, and does our policy, does our training, does our interaction with the communities, does all that work together in one group? And it should always kind of, I think, more for change with what's desired at the time.
Well, that sort of leads me to touch upon one of the questions that was on the list. So, Lou, you have been, in addition to all your national and international positions, you've been chief in LaGrange for 28 or 9 years by now. Stacy, you have grown up in your department, and I actually, your former chief and mentor, who's deceased, Bobby Moody, mentored me into the law enforcement community. CJ, you grew up in APD, and I've worked with you for many years. And then after ending here as deputy chief, you got the position in Durham as chief of police, and you've been there now for 3 or 4 years.
Almost 5.
For almost 5. Who's counting?
Almost
5 So
right.
how do you see this whole issue of building trust with the community? Okay, one has been there for a very long time. The other one has been there for a long time. You've been there for a short time. You came in as an outsider to Durham. All of the communities these days are diversified, and they have their own local beat, so to speak. How do you build that trust with the community?
Well, you know, for me personally, I think building relationships really means that you have to go where people are, and you have to meet people where they are, and you have to be authentic in your conversations. You can't smoke screen issues at all. You have to be honest about what is. And I think people really need to know who you are beyond the uniform. My profession is, you know, I'm a police chief, but I don't wake up in the morning with the uniform on. I wake up in the morning just like any other community member. And I feel the same way that my neighbors feel about certain issues. When I see things on the news that disturb me, my mouth drops open just like theirs do. And the uniform just puts me in a position to get out there and try to impact the change. And you know, having those kind of conversations and being honest about who we are as police professionals, not just me as a police chief, but police officers. There are officers out there who care and on a daily basis are, performing in ways that they don't get credit for it, and they don't ask for credit for it. This is who they are as human beings. And I think we don't tell that story to our community enough so that people can see the other side of law enforcement, because we all know what hits the news at nighttime. It's the sensationalized stories. It's the tabloid kinds of incidents. And we don't do a good enough job, I think, not just in my agency, and we're working on that, but around the country about the wonderful work that law enforcement officers do every day. So to answer your question, I say building trust is a day-by-day sort of process, and it has to be baked into the department. It can't be just the police chief. Every encounter, every police officer has to be part of that relationship building process. And if it's not the culture of the department, and you don't have officers that buy into that philosophy, and their philosophy or their operations are congruent, then you'll never build the type of trust that's needed. So, and that in itself, and we talk about culture, that in itself, I think, is the elephant in the room. And Lou and Stacy have heard me say over and over again that culture eats policy for lunch. We talk about policy and building relationships, but if we don't check the culture of the department and ensure that our officers understand what we stand for, and that I can't go into the community and build that relationship every day, each one of you are responsible for that. So I digress.
No, that's good.
And I would say everything that CJ said, absolutely. If I could define trust, I think I would do it with the one word that also defines community policing, which is partnerships. Separate and apart from that, and I think in too many instances, we've been slow to do it, is examining our policies and our procedures in a way that looks at outcomes. And just pointing to a policy and saying that's our policy when it negatively impacts aspects of your community, and the policy does more harm, or the enforcement action does more harm than the actual violation or the issue you're trying to address, then we've got to be prepared to recalibrate, how we enforce particular ordinances or laws. Give you an example. You get somebody that's living paycheck to paycheck. They got just a basic job, and they get arrested for an open container. So we take them to the county jail. They can't post a bond, so they sit in jail for 2 days, and the judge is always going to OR them on this when they come in for the initial appearance. But if they had a job on Saturday, guess what they don't have on Saturday? They don't have that job because they didn't show up because they're in jail. And so that enforcement action now has introduced chaos into the life of that individual and their family, if they're supporting a family. And so part of what our team has done is gone through 30 plus misdemeanor and city ordinance violations, taken them to the courts and said, hey, unless there's an aggravating circumstance, we'd like to go ahead and just process and release. And so we spent 20 grand to set up a booking area in the PD, and a couple of things have happened. One is the person you arrested now becomes your partner because you explain that, hey, let me process you, you'll be released on the ticket, you're not going to jail. And so we see our use of force going down. We also get the support in the community that understands that they could have gone to jail, but because we've made some adjustments, they didn't go to jail. And this isn't being soft on crime. This is, as I like to, quote CJ, we're we're tough on crime, we're soft on people. And so I think examining the opportunities we have to create value in what we do, that's what people are looking for. That's their frustration with the educational system. They don't see value. They're paying a lot of money, but kids can't figure out how to make change for $5.01 transition or transaction if you give them a $10 bill and a penny. So just like there's frustration with the educational system with a lack of value, I think there's frustration with policing, because what's obvious to citizens is, why are you doing this? It doesn't make sense. It's harming people. And we point to our historic role, and for reasons that aren't clear to me, we seem married to it. And so we've come up with dozens of different ways to create value and act as an ombudsman for our citizens. Give you one other quick example, car care program. I see our role as limiting discretion in enforcement. This idea that officers, depending upon how they're feeling on a given day, will decide an enforcement outcome, to me, eludes just sound judgment. Two different people, two different violations, two different outcomes based on, quote, officer discretion. So reeling in officer discretion through policy. And an example I'll use is the car care program, where we have a policy after we went around to all of our automotive stores and said, if we come up with a coupon, put your business on it, will you agree to give a 10% discount? And instead of writing folks tickets, we give them that coupon for a discount. It totally changes the interaction between the officer and the individual, where I have African Americans that have gone on and posted saying, I thought I was going to be profiled. I thought I was going to be harassed. I couldn't believe when the officer greeted me, pointed out the defect, and gave me a coupon. I mean, it just changes that whole enforcement action. Now, we still write a warning. We don't give it to them. It goes in our system. And a month later, if it isn't fixed, then they get the ticket. But there's a host of those opportunities that we can examine and make enforcement not one of compliance, but one of cooperation.
And really, to tell you the truth, that's a culture change. What you just described is not traditional policing, because traditional policing was about, bean counting. How many arrests you made, how many traffic tickets, you made, but who does that really benefit? And does it really benefit the community as a whole? And I know I jumped in, but I just couldn't help but say that. It goes back to what you were saying, Lou, about 18,000 police agencies. How many police agencies are really looking at their departments to see how they can benefit the community as a whole? How can we keep people out of jail? How can we lock up people who really need to be in jail and be laser focused about dealing with violent crime? But the guy who has a small amount of marijuana, who's never been in jail before, does it do anything for me or my department or the community to put that guy in jail? Why change my policies where we have a misdemeanor diversion program now that by policy, if you look in that system and that person is not in the system at all for anything, and they're under the age of 25, you will not put them in jail. You will put them in the misdemeanor diversion program. They'll be in that program for 12 months. And we have a 99% success rate. And instead of locking up 275 people who went in that program last year, those were 275 people that don't have records right now. And we used our time doing something more productive, like getting violent criminals off the street. So I just applaud you, Lou, for steering your department in that direction.
Well, let me chime in, Robbie, if I got a second on that, because I want to throw a different angle to that I think, and I agree with both of those takes from what we can do internally and how we can address that. One of the things that I think, though, that we're seeing across the nation, and I think we're all experiencing it, is if somebody's passionate about a certain issue of enforcement, for example, what do? They go out to their local city council or to their state legislatures and ask for something to be passed. You know, think about texting and driving. You know, it's all, you know, how dangerous it might be. And then they pass a law and then they can't understand why we're not enforcing it. You know, how come I see all these people texting? And I'll give you an example here in Covington. We had a state route went right through our scenic downtown square. And the council, when they moved the state route off of it, council passed an ordinance, no big trucks. And now I have a group of citizens that want us to stop and cite every truck that comes through there. What we found though is that GPS is bringing them through that area, and they have no knowledge of that it's a problem. Normally enforcement would correct the behavior and change people, and they would know not to come through there. The problem is that every truck driver is a different truck driver coming from another state. And so when they get the one citation, they're never coming back through anyway, because their truck route's probably not, they're not repeat offenders is what I'm getting at. And we could write 1,000 tickets to 1,000 different truck drivers. It's not going to change behavior because it's probably the only one time they were ever going to come through our town. Now, me, you, and the rest of us know that that's the issue, but I can't get the citizen to understand that. And they demand that we are out there writing those tickets and don't really care what the alternative might be. And I think if you stop and think about that with our social justice questions and things that are going on in the country, saying, why do you do this? Why do you enforce that? I think we need to have a bigger discussion along with our elected officials at whatever level to understand, just like what Lou and CJ are talking about, that we have created laws that impact people in a negative way and create that criminal history in a negative way over things that people, and if you're passionate about that, for example, pedestrian fatalities impact the minority communities, because that's what we see. They don't go the crosswalk and cross in a safe manner. But if you write them a ticket, you're starting that process of putting them into the system. So it's a catch-22. How do you improve that quality of life? And you know, for example, in the state of Georgia, Governor's Office of Highway Safety may have a grant, and they're putting things out on the radio and the TV about use your crosswalks and be safe when you cross. But that message is not being heeded by the people who are dying in our streets by being hit by cars. And then we're looked at. But then think about it. We write a ticket for jaywalking. And who do we look like?
Right.
We look like we're picking on people. And so there's the dilemma, you know, and I think you can take that to a lot of the cases. I like to tell people all the time that law enforcement is the flashpoint of the problems in our society, and we have to deal with them. And when they go good and we can deal with problems and help people improve their lives and the situation in the communities, then it's great. But if it goes bad and it happens to be a small level or a low level enforcement issue, like a misdemeanor type charge that results in a use of force issue, the two don't marry up. And it's a tough thing for us to deal with. We've got to get other outside people to start understanding that what you're putting upon us to enforce is causing a domino effect and affecting citizens and groups of people that adversely, and we're the ones getting hung with the responsibility of it when it wasn't the intent at all.
Thank you, Stacy. Before we go on to the next question, a big part of the conversation until now was making reference to leadership. And I want to bring in a guest to the discussion, who is Colonel Itzhak Almog, who is a police attaché of the Israel Police to North America. And he's actually close to finishing his 5-year term and going back to Israel. I had the pleasure of working closely with him. He's also a member of the board of the IACP, so all of you know him as well. And I'd like Colonel Almog just to talk very briefly about leadership issues as seen from the Israel Police, and then we'll go on to the next question. Colonel Almog, it's all yours.
Thank you, Abi. First of all, let me start with my compliments for this initiative to gather all of us, chief of police all over, to discuss. And I think it's the right things on the right step on the right direction. Second, I would like to thank Chief CJ, Chief Dachmer, and Chief Stacy. It's always good to hear words of wisdom from the three of you, and it's happened all the time. So thank you for your words of wisdom. Now, when we are talking about policing in general, policing is known to be a profession all over the world. And the significant difference between police officer to police chief, mainly in the area of responsibility. I mean, the authorities that police officer and chief of police got are almost the same by the penal code, especially I can talk about Israel. The difference between to be a sergeant and to be, let's say, a colonel, or to be even a brigadier general, got nothing to do with authority. They have almost the same authority. The difference, and the main difference, is their responsibility. By taking decision of chief of police, of course, sometimes got to do with human life and other crucial things. Therefore, we found it a very crucial issue to do something, to build a special program. And a few years ago, we established this leadership center at the Israel National Police Academy. I think that some of you visited there, and you know what I'm talking about. The main idea is to build kind of agenda and policy for the troops on the fields. And it's got to do with research, discussion, panels, and outlook, so many different things that create together the meaning, the right things to do with responsibility and to improve things. Of course, by the eye of democracy, region, and according to the law. So I think that by talking today about responsibility, about leadership, part of it is to think that maybe to create all over kind of a model based on something that you guys have in Atlanta, or Georgia, with the Center of Leadership Center is the right things to do. And I would like to wish all of us a fruitful discussion today. Thank you, Rabbi, for letting me talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colonel Mog. A pleasure to have you. And I want to sort of tap this concept of responsibility that you've talked about and move it from the individual leader to the organization. And here's a challenging question. After that, we'll probably go into Q&A. And if you have questions, please write them up on the Q&A button in the bottom of the screen. Oftentimes, and more often than not, when there's crime in the community, those responsible, quote unquote, for reporting it are the chief of police, sometimes the mayor or city manager. But mostly it's the chief of police, and it's the police department that is being seen as causing, quote unquote, the number of crimes in a community. So a lot of chiefs are very happy to be proud of crime when it goes down. They're not very quick to take the blame to go when it goes up. But the issue is much more complicated, because when we talked about the responsibility, whose responsibility is it to have crime in the community? Who produces crime? If we look at doctors in an emergency room, they produce medical services. They do not produce the epidemiology that produces the people who end up in the emergency room. And it's not that different from police. So my question to you is, how do you bring in additional elements in the community, whether it's the municipal, different departments, whether it's the business community, voluntary associations, civic leaders, to take at least as much responsibility for what is happening in the community as the police? Because if the police are not the producers of crime, why should police be seen as solving crimes beyond solving an investigation? But how can police, or why should police be seen as the crime reducer in the community?
I think, first of all, I think you don't look to point fingers, you look to create partnerships. Exactly. And how there's responsibility for crime is a symptom of all these other problems. And so how do we act as the ombudsman to showcase where these issues are so that these other resources can engage in a more meaningful way? And that when they go to government agencies for funding for these resources, we're standing next to them to support them. The other is we need to let policymakers know what the consequences are of their policies. There's been we heard about mass incarceration. We've heard about alternatives to incarceration, and we've not seen a lot of discussion on the consequences. And let me give you a couple of quick numbers that I think bring home what the facts are. In the 90s, when we had a population of about 270 million, we had 25,000 homicides. A couple of 3 years ago, country of 330 million, we had 12,000 homicides. Why? Because we had the right people locked up. This last year, we've had 10 homicides. That's almost double what I usually have. We did a background on every victim and on every suspect. Everyone but one, victim and suspect, parole, probation, out on bond for violent offenses. So I did a presentation to the council outlining it. I asked them to pass a resolution outlining the facts and to send it to the governor, the House Speaker, the Board of Parole, and the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice. So I think we've got to be better at putting context into these criminal acts, because everybody points at the police. And on one homicide suspect, 33 cycles he's had, 33 cycles. So more than 33 arrests before this last homicide.
Thank you.
Well,
CJ?
Well, I was just going to add to that. Last week, we had a meeting with our DA along with some other key city officials. And we've been having these very honest conversations about what is. Because you're absolutely right, Robbie. Everybody expects the police to suppress crime. When crime goes up, everybody looks at the police department. They don't look at cause and effect. They don't look at, the criminal justice system, the whole ecosystem of recidivism and how that happens and where the breakdowns are. All they look at is the police department. So to have everybody at the table and taking ownership and being honest with them about that person who not only committed a homicide last year, was the victim of a homicide this year because you let him out when he should have been in jail, or his bond wasn't set at a rate where it needed to be. And our responsibility is to protect the community. And that's what the community expects from us. But there's so many other entities in this whole ecosystem of criminal justice that is really not at the table from a preventive standpoint, from a social services standpoint, from an educational standpoint. There are so many areas that, have not really stepped up or taken ownership, that people are a product of their environments. Kids will be what they see. If they grow up with drugs and poverty and domestic violence, then, we have some Cinderella stories, but many of our children become victims of their environment because there's nothing stopping them from that trajectory. So it really does require people who are in leadership positions to take ownership of their piece of this, this whole cycle. I would love to see less police officers. We have job security. Everybody talk about defund the police, but they're not going to defund the police because the police are the only ones out there dealing with social service issues. The police are the only ones that are out there really trying to, help young people to some degree to stay out of, gang activity and so on. We do a lot of the heavy lifting. And that's why I haven't been very concerned, because now some of the knee-jerk reaction from defund the police is having a boomerang effect on a lot of agencies around the country. So that collaboration and having sort of a holistic approach to what our community problems are, is the way forward. And until we can have those honest conversations that, no, we don't want to put everybody in jail, but there's some people that need to go to jail. Some people need to go to jail and some people need to stay in jail. And you know, I might get beat up for saying that, but it's true.
Thank you, CJ. Lou or Stacy, anything else before we move to Q&A?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would like to chime in on both of those comments is that, and I said it a minute ago, we're the flashpoint of what goes on or goes wrong in our society. I think it's very interesting that one of the things that's been talked about a lot over the last years, we need to have more social workers answering calls instead of police officers. They want to defund the police and put more social workers out there. And we keep talking about police, but I'm actually a Georgia peace officer. And my job fundamentally is to keep the peace. I don't think you can ever get away from the first response of showing up and making sure that the peace is being kept. The problem is we don't have the resources to help us do the job after the peace is being kept. And I give you a good example was my former DA, who's now a Superior Court judge, saw a need for a child advocacy center here in our judicial district covering 2 counties. And he, along with myself and about 12 other citizens, worked to create a child advocacy center. We brought it up out of the ground, raised money, and formulate our own nonprofit child advocacy center to serve about 200 children a year on average that needed a child advocacy services. To me, that's reprehensible that we should have to even work to do that. That our children should be taken care of, and those resources should be out there provided for by our government as an asset and a partner with law enforcement. Same way with Department of Children, Family and Children Services. I served on our local board and on a regional board here in North Georgia. We were having a 40 to 45% turnover rate in caseworkers, social workers working investigative cases around the state of Georgia, because you were paying college educated people $23,000 a year to do a job that, quite frankly, is as hard as ours is, if not sometimes harder. And luckily our former governor, our current governor, have done things to raise their pay up to get them to where their turnover is stopping. But there should be so many more social workers out here that we can reach out to once we've arrived on the scene and realize we're not dealing with a criminal act, but somebody that's in a social need, and have those people available to us as a resource. Yes, we need social workers out here responding to some of these calls with us, partnering with us, and helping us do the things that we need to do. I said it earlier, things that go on are usually a flashpoint in our society, and people look for us to handle it because it's the way it's always been handled before. But if you want different outcomes, we need some assistance to help us have those outcomes, and we need those resources. We look at our drug addiction problem. We need places to send people. You want to legalize the drugs, you got to give us the places to send people to help them when they need that help, because it's a problem. I'm restating everything we already know, but I think that's something I'm hoping this is an opportunity for us to step back as a country and a society and say, what can we do differently across the board to help law enforcement do the job, and only use us for the really serious things. Like CJ said, the people that need to be in jail, we'll take care of those folks, and let others help us do the things that we need to do.
Thank you, Stacy. Lou, do you want to add anything else, or should we go to Q&A?
I would just, share one fact with you. One individual affected by mental illness in the last 3 years, we've responded 70 times. 70 times. And if there's a bad outcome where he's shot or killed, the focus is going to be on that incident, not 70 times that he was transported somewhere where efforts were made to connect him with services. And so that's our challenge, is to put context into these outcomes that folks want to isolate into one incident when there's a chronology that indicts the lack of services and resources.
Thank you, Lou. We have about 5 minutes left, and if we need to, we can stay probably another 2 or 3 minutes. I'm going to ask Colonel Brent Cummings, GILEE Associate Director, to handle the questions that you submitted.
Thanks, Robbie, and thanks to all our panelists today. This has just been a fascinating discussion for, I think, everyone, but especially for me. And I want to say to each of you, thank you for your service, your continued service, and what you're doing in your communities. It's very much appreciated. You know, you three know I have a military background coming to GILEE, and Simon Sinek wrote a book that says is titled "Leaders Eat Last." He took that from some visits with military units, but I think you were all a perfect example of eaters eating last. You're putting in this discussion today, this frank discussion you're having fits right into what Simon writes about in his book. And so again, just thanks for what you're doing. A lot of discussion today has been, you know, looking outward, and it's been great. But I had an earlier discussion today, and a written question came in from Chief James Davis out of Franklin Springs, Georgia. And he is kind of shaping it and turning it. I think a great question, you know, looking internally. We've looked at how we engage with communities outside, but how do you as leaders look internally? And specifically, his question he addresses as he sees what he says he's found a very disturbing problem. It's a lack of leadership of holding information and conversations from subordinates confidential. You know, how do you do that internally in your organizations? How do you, you know, if it gets out to the rank and file as what he talks about, it really just erodes a lot of that trust. Could each of you kind of address how you hold some of those confidential issues, anything from internal discipline, mental health issues, just different concerns internally to give that confidence to your officers?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it. I saw Lou was taking a deep breath there. He was about to take a stab at it. You know, keeping information, controlling information in police departments, I'm telling you, that's a beast. It's a beast no matter if the agency is large or small. Because one thing about police, they like juicy information and they like sending it. And I don't care what rank they are, some of your highest level commanders sometimes can't hold water. So what I do is I have a frank conversation with the people that I've selected as part of my leadership team. And we really talk about how important confidentiality is and what the ramifications are for not holding in information. And one thing that I prided myself in the Atlanta Police Department was being able to hold information and knowing that sometimes, you know, tidbits of information could completely disrupt the operation. And most of the time when it gets out there, it's not true. It's, you know, it's got a spin on it. And that's what really, really has caused me to be, you know, very pointed about how we communicate. So every week I have a staff meeting with those executive staff members. But what I started doing here in Durham is I actually have a staff meeting once a month out in the district with the same executive staff members, allowing officers to come in and sit in on the meetings that I'm having with my exec team, because most of what I'm talking about is not secret squirrel information.
Right.
Most of it is about the operation of the police department, some of the planning that we're doing, equipment issues, budget issues. And believe it or not, that has helped dispel rumors. That has helped to kill that mid-management or mid-level, you know, disconnect sometimes. And I think as organizations, we have to stop treating information as oh, this is a big secret. Everything in policing is a big secret. It's not a secret. And we need to be more transparent with our officers, because they'll get distracted and they won't be focusing on the work that needs, you know, that they need to be focusing on. So I say find creative ways to communicate effectively at all levels and help everybody to understand the ramifications of not appreciating good communication.
Thanks, CJ. I think you kind of hit on that really well. We're kind of coming towards the end of our time. And I'll let you have the last say on that. I know Lou was getting ready to push in there, and I know there's some great comments, but just maybe Lou and Stacy, you could. We've had some other questions that talk about retaining officers, and it relates to what CJ's talking about, retaining officers and also recruiting officers, particularly minorities, and adding that to your departments. Could you two maybe address that issue, retainment of officers, and I think that ties into the trust issue, and then I'll turn it back to Robbie for closing comments, and we'll step out. Go ahead. Thanks.
Oh, interestingly enough, we've had great recruitment success, particularly with minorities. I just looked for what was our turnover last year, and it was, I think, 14%, which I've read anywhere from 18 to 30%, depending upon the agency. So I'm at the point where I've kind of adopted the military model. People go into the military for different reasons. They're taught to perform certain tasks. The military looks at those folks that look like they're going to commit to the age or to the organization, and then they start investing. And Brent, you were in the military, you understand this. They see NCO potential, so they start investing in them. And those folks that are going to just pass through, they're able to do a job, they do it well, but they're probably not going to be committed. And before you make those those heavy investments, you have the conversation. So I think there's a couple of things. You have a track for folks that want promotion. You have a track for folks that want to remain a police officer but can become a master police officer. So they have goals, they have incentives, their commitments recognized through pay raises. Likewise, you develop folks that you want in your command and your supervision ranks. And I think having a reputation for openness, transparency, and folks getting a fair break. And your best recruiters, the folks that work for you. We give a $500 recruitment bonus to anybody that brings somebody on and they make it through FTO. As soon as I clear them through FTO, they get a check for $500.
I agree with what Lou's saying. I mean, this past year, I've lost more officers than I've ever lost in the history of my 23 years as police chief. And obviously it's because of the, several things. I think our officers are depressed because of the COVID, just like everybody else in the country, of not being able to do normal activities and the things that are on us. And then on top of that, the civil unrest and the hits that law enforcement is taking in general. But I did hire 3 back in the fall, new young people who wanted to come get into this job, and they are just as on fire about being a police officer as I've seen in quite a while, I'll be honest with you. And so just like when 9/11 occurred, and just like when other flashpoint type situations have occurred in our profession, there are people that see the challenge and run towards it, which is the basis of what we want in a law enforcement person. And so I think we have to recognize and understand that, our recruitment efforts need to continue on, and they need to adjust as the needs are out here in our society. And we are recruiting a different person than I was recruited back in 1987. And we need to be a little, like CJ was saying a little earlier, and Lou, people who are understanding that, maybe a warning today is better than a ticket. Maybe if we can work for a diversion here instead of just putting somebody in jail, or understanding the reason why we have a chase policy that's restrictive is because it protects more citizens than it puts people in jail. If we start going after people who have that type of mindset, we're going to see the longevity return back, and we're going to see more people that we see people right now that want to be part of this change that the country is asking us to change with. And I think if we embrace those people, it'll help us make the change that our citizens are expecting from us.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Stacey.
Stacey.
Thanks all. I want to thank you again for your service to all those that are listening in. We will, if you have other questions for those that we didn't get to, we will try to get back to you. And other questions, please send them to us here at GILEE, and we'll do our best to answer them. Robbie, you want to close us out?
Thank you, Brent. And I want to thank Chief Davis, Chief Cotton, and Chief Dekmar for, all I can say is that the time passed so quickly that we could have easily spent another hour and still not cover all of it, which is exactly how it should be. I want again to thank all of you and all of those who watched us and tuned in. We will post this on the GILEE website and we'll send you the link so you can watch the full recording if you had to leave earlier. As I mentioned in the beginning, those of you who are interested in post credits, please, you will get an email after the session today and just complete the information that is required. We will meet next time on March 31st, and we had 3 chiefs of local government, so to speak. We are going to have 3 heads of state agencies, 2 from Georgia and 1 from Tennessee, on March 31st, and the invitations will be in the email soon. Thank you all again, and see you next time.
Thank you. It's an honor.
Bye. Thank you.